is irony? Irony is a gap. It's a gap of meaning or outcome. It's the gap between what something apparently means and what it actually means, so long as that gap tells you something. Or it's a gap between an expected outcome and the actual outcome, so long as that gap tells you something. Let's take one of the most common forms of irony, sarcasm. When you drop a plate of food on the floor and your friend says, "Good job," she's probably being ironic. The gap in meaning is between what your friend seems to be saying, "You did a good job," and what she actually means, "Bad job," or "You're clumsy." This is intentional irony. The gap in meaning is between what the words seem to say and what the person is actually saying by being sarcastic. But irony can be unintentional. Another form of irony is an unexpected outcome that teaches you something. Let's say your grandmother tells you to always keep track of time. She tells you every day, if you keep track of time, you'll never be late. One night, when you're expecting her for dinner, she shows up 3 hours late. When you ask her why, she admits that she lost track of time. This is an ironic situation. Why? Because the gap between what you'd expect and what actually happens tells you something. You expect your grandmother to keep track of time, and you expect her to show up on time. Instead, she loses track of time, and she shows up 3 hours late. The irony here lies in the significance of the difference, or what the difference teaches you about your grandmother or your false expectations. What does the gap teach you? It teaches you that your grandmother doesn't take her own advice. She tells you one thing, but does something else. That's an irony. So as you can see from these examples, irony always involves three elements: the obvious, the apparent or the expected meaning or outcome, which is false, and the actual meaning or outcome, which is true, and the significance of the difference. Sometimes the difference between the obvious and the actual carries a lot of significance. Take your friend who says, "Good job," when she actually means, "Bad job." The obvious here is the apparent or surface meaning of her words, "good job," the literal meaning of her message. If you took your friend literally and thought the obvious were true, you'd think you did a good job. But of course that's not what she's saying. The actual in this case is, "You're clumsy." The significance here is very high, because the actual is the complete opposite of the obvious. The difference tells you that your friend's being sarcastic, and that she thinks you're clumsy. Significance is the extra layer of meaning that irony requires. With Grandma, the obvious is the expected outcome, expecting her to take her own advice and keep track of time. The actual is what actually happens. She shows up late and admits she lost track of time. The significance of the difference is that Grandma doesn't take her own advice. She's a hypocrite. That's an unintentional irony. Since some ironies are bigger than others, how do you measure them? Try writing the obvious, the actual, and the significance as a math equation. Think of it this way. Irony is the difference between the obvious and the actual multiplied by the significance, or obvious minus actual, in parentheses, times significance. Because the significance can vary, some ironies are bigger or richer than others. Let's turn to some dramatic examples of irony in stories, humor, and history. First, let's take one of Aesop's fables. Fables are stories with a moral or a lesson. This is a famous one, The Boy Who Cried Wolf. As the story goes, once upon a time, a shepherd boy was bored watching his sheep. So he entertained himself by loudly yelling out to the nearby village, "Wolf!" But in fact, there was no wolf. And when the villagers came running, they found out it was a false alarm. The boy cried wolf a few more times, and each time they came running again with the same result. Finally, one day, a wolf actually appeared. This time, when the boy cried, "Wolf! Wolf!" the villagers did not come. They didn't believe him. So the wolf ate the flock of sheep. The moral of this story, if it isn't obvious, is that even when habitual liars tell the truth, they probably won't be believed. So what was the obvious in this story? For any irony, it's a good idea to focus on the ending, or the outcome. What is the apparent or expected meaning or outcome when the boy cried wolf after seeing an actual wolf? For the boy, the obvious was the expectation that the villagers would come again. The actual, or the actual meaning or outcome, was that they didn't. The significance of the difference was that they didn't come when he most needed them, because they came before when he was merely wasting their time. The significance is the moral. Lying makes you less believable, leading others to abandon you when you need them most. Let's look at an example of incongruent meaning, another kind of irony. Take a look at this image of Homer Simpson from the TV show The Simpsons. What is the obvious about this image and its written message? What is the actual? For any irony, try focusing on the message. The obvious here is the message that Homer is an all-American dad, which would literally mean he's one of the best dads in America. The actual is that he's behaving in a threatening way. So the significance of the difference is that Homer, contrary to those words, isn't the best dad in America. You can measure the irony by the significant gap between the words and the image, which are opposed. For a third example, let's turn to history and take a famous example of irony in action, the use of irony by the civil rights activists fighting racism in the early 1960s. In 1960, white and African American college students began sitting in at segregated American lunch counters that served whites only. Just by sitting down for lunch, these students brought profound changes to the way people thought about freedom in the United States. They were often met with violence and ridicule. You can see people dumping food on them in this photograph. Even without saying a word, these activists were behaving ironically. They were dramatizing a gap in meaning. What they acted out was an irony that's something like calling someone's bluff in poker. They took certain principles at their word, or literally, though they knew the principles weren't actually shared by their political opponents. What they took literally was the American ideal that all men are created equal. And they behaved as if this belief were recognized by everybody, which of course it wasn't. The white people dumping the food on other people in that photograph didn't believe that African Americans and whites were equal. That was the irony that the sit-in movement was hoping to dramatize. The gap in meaning was between the obvious of what should be and the actual of what actually was. The obvious was, all men are created equal. The actual was, except at segregated lunch counters. And the significance of the difference was that those who supported segregation obviously didn't support equality. So the next time someone asks you what irony means, tell her it's the difference between the obvious, or expected, and the actual, or what actually happens, as long as that difference tells you something. Thank you for watching, and I mean that sincerely, not ironically.